Preston Tucker built 51 cars in 1948, and almost every one of them carried engineering that the rest of Detroit would not match for another 30 years. Then the federal government walked into his factory and shut the whole operation down. Here are 8 features on the 1948 Tucker that were 3 decades ahead of their time. And the feature at number 1 is the reason the rest of the industry could not afford to let him win. Number 8, the directional center headlight. Tucker, 1948. The idea was that a car ought to be able to see around a corner before the driver had finished turning into it. On a dark rural road in 1948, the 2 sealed beam headlights pointed dead ahead while the road itself curved away into black. A driver leaning into a bend was steering the first half of the corner on faith. Tucker decided faith was a poor substitute for a lamp. He mounted a third headlight in the center of the nose, set between the 2 ordinary ones, and wired it directly to the steering. Turned the wheel past 10 degrees, and the center lamp swiveled with the front wheels, throwing a beam into the curve like a flashlight following a pointing finger. The 2 outer lamps stared straight ahead. The middle one went hunting for the road. The center lamp became the car's face, the single detail every onlooker remembered. The trouble was the law. 17 states had rules forbidding any automobile from wearing more than 2 headlights, written before anyone imagined a third one that could think. Tucker answered with a small chrome cover that bolted over the third eye, where the statute had not caught up to the engineering. Today, adaptive cornering headlights that pivot into a turn are a premium upgrade on German luxury sedans. The fanciest versions bend a grid of computer-controlled beams around oncoming traffic, sold as a marvel of the modern age and priced like one. The principle is identical to the one a doomed company shipped on a steel sedan more than 70 years ago. Tucker did not bolt a gimmick onto the front of the car. He taught the headlight to read the road. Number 7, the pop-out windshield. Tucker, 1948. The idea was that in a serious wreck, the last thing a passenger should meet face first was a sheet of glass that refused to leave. In 1948, the windshield was one of the most dangerous objects in any car, a fixed pane that stayed put while the bodies inside kept moving forward. Laminated safety glass itself was still an option on many cars, sold as an extra rather than a given. Tucker turned that logic inside out. He seated the windshield in a soft rubber gasket instead of bonding it rigidly into the frame. A hard enough impact would shove the entire laminated pane up and out, away from the people rather than into them. The glass was made to leave the car in one piece and carry its own sharp edges with it. It behaved less like a wall and more like a trap door waiting for a reason to open. It was safety thinking borrowed straight from the aircraft hangar. The proof arrived during testing. When a Tucker rolled over at speed on the proving ground, the windshield ejected exactly as drawn. The test driver, Eddie Offutt, climbed out of the wreck and walked away. Most of the industry that year still treated occupant injury as the customer's personal failing. A thoughtful, padded interior was money thrown at people who should simply have driven better. Today, the logic has flipped completely. The modern windshield is glued in on purpose with structural adhesive. Engineers learned the bonded glass helps hold the roof up when the car lands on it. Same enemy, opposite weapon. Tucker did not guess wrong about how to protect a passenger. He guessed early and reached for the problem years before the regulators would admit it had a name. Number 6, the passenger crash chamber. Tucker, 1948. The idea was that a front seat passenger who saw the wreck coming should have somewhere to go besides through the dashboard. An accident in 1948 usually meant the body of the car and the body of the human stopped at very different speeds. Preston Tucker had built gun turrets and combat vehicles during the war, and he thought about a cabin the way an aircraft designer thinks about a cockpit. Where every rival fitted a glove box, Tucker carved out a deep padded footwell beneath the dash and named it the crash chamber. The passenger was meant to drop down into it in the half second before impact, the body folded below the line of the dash and out of the path of flying steel. The car offered a hole to hide in, a padded foxhole lined in wool, built into a luxury sedan. The flaw was human. It asked a terrified person to make a calm, correct decision in about 1 second, which is precisely not what terrified people do. The chamber rewarded the disciplined and abandoned everyone else, and it cost Tucker the glove box that buyers actually wanted. It was protection that depended on the passenger behaving like a trained pilot. Tucker trusted the human to act, where modern engineering decided not to gamble on it. There is no modern descendant of the crash chamber because the modern answer is the AR bag. The first production airbags did not arrive until the 1970s, and they would not become standard for another 20 years after that. The airbag does the diving for the passenger and never asks anyone to predict the future. Tucker did not solve the problem of the passenger in a crash. He was simply the first to admit, in steel and padding, that the problem was worth solving at all. The crash chamber is the entire company in miniature. A brilliant instinct, half a generation early, betting everything on a human being who did not yet exist. Number 5. The padded safety dashboard. Tucker, 1948. The idea was simple and uncomfortable. The surfaces closest to a passenger's skull should be the softest things in the car, not the hardest. Detroit in the 1940s built its dashboards out of bright painted steel. They were gorgeous under the showroom lights and lethal in a collision. A chrome mantelpiece bolted at exactly head height. The dashboard had been a place to mount a clock and a radio, never a place to think about a skull. Tucker patted the dash, sank the controls below the surface, and pulled the instrument panel back and away from the front passenger. The cabin was laid out around the crash instead of around the brochure. A buyer in the showroom could admire chrome. He could not admire the absence of a head injury he would never suffer. The friction was the oldest one in the business. The padding added cost and weight to fix a danger the buyer could not see while kicking the tires, and safety does not sparkle under the lights. Ford would learn the same lesson in 1956, when it spent a fortune marketing a safety package and watched the market shrug and buy the prettier competition instead. The lesson the industry drew was brutal and wrong. Safety did not sell, so safety could wait. The padded dashboard finally became federal law in the United States in 1968. That was a full 2 decades after a bankrupt outfit had shipped it as standard equipment on a car the government had already helped to bury. Tucker did not anticipate the safety rulebook. He wrote its first chapter and never got his name on the cover. 20 years is the distance between an idea being dangerous to the established order and the very same idea being printed as the minimum legal requirement. Number 4. The steering column built to collapse. Tucker, 1948. The idea was that in a head-on crash, the steering column should not behave like a spear aimed directly at the driver's heart. For years, the steering assembly was among the most common ways a driver died in a frontal wreck, the car impaling the very person steering it. The column was a rigid steel shaft running straight from the wheel to the front axle. It was perfectly aligned to ram backward into the chest when the front of the car stopped and the driver did not. Tucker attacked the danger from 2 directions at once. He moved the steering box behind the front axle out of the line of fire, and he held a patent for a column designed to give way under impact rather than stand firm and transmit it. The shaft was engineered to lose the fight on purpose. It was a small, unglamorous patent worth more lives than any tail fin ever sold. The cost was the usual cost. Building a part whose only job is to fail correctly is expensive engineering, and correct failure is a strange thing to print on a price tag. General Motors made the energy-absorbing steering column standard in 1967, and the federal government soon required it across the industry. That was 19 years after a small company in Chicago had already filed the principle with the patent office. Tucker did not try to build a stronger steering column. He had the rare sense to make it weak in precisely the right way at precisely the right moment. Number 3, the rear-mounted helicopter engine. Air-cooled motors, 1948. The idea was to mount a large, smooth, slow-turning engine behind the passengers. Its weight would press the driven wheels into the road and its racket would stay out of the cabin. Tucker's first attempt was a monster. It was a 589 cubic inch flat 6 with its valves opened by oil pressure rather than a camshaft, and no head gaskets at all. It carried so much exotic ambition that it could barely be persuaded to start. After burning nearly a year on an engine that did not work, the company stopped dreaming and went shopping, and it found its answer in the sky. The production engine was a Franklin Flat 6, lifted almost directly out of the Bell 47 helicopter and built by a firm called Air-Cooled Motors. Tucker thought so much of it that he bought the entire engine company outright. His people converted the aircraft engine from air cooling to water cooling and bolted it into the tail of the sedan. The whole arrangement turned the usual layout around, with luggage space up front and the power out back. It displaced about 334 cubic inches and produced 166 horsepower. The torque was a lazy, generous 372 pound-feet. That was enough to walk the car to 60 miles per hour in roughly 10 seconds, and on toward a top speed near 130 miles per hour. A heavy engine slung out behind the rear axle gave the car traction off the line and a distinctive way of leaning into fast corners. Each engine cost $5,000, which for a company already bleeding money was a wound it could not really afford. A rear-mounted flat 6 is today the sacred signature of the Porsche 911, sold for six figures and discussed in tones normally reserved for scripture. Tucker did not reach for a helicopter engine out of pure desperation. He heard an aircraft idling and recognized the heartbeat of a car nobody else could hear yet. Number 2, the four-wheel independent suspension, Tucker, 1948. The idea was that every wheel should be free to deal with its own piece of broken road. No single wheel should telegraph its shock across to the other three and up into the passengers' spines. Most American cars in 1948 still rode on solid axles and steel leaf springs. It was a farm wagon arrangement that chained the wheels together and passed every pothole straight through the floorboards. Tucker gave all four corners their own fully independent suspension. Then he threw out the steel springs altogether and replaced them with rubber torsion units that simply twisted to swallow the bumps. The rubber units needed no grease, no seasonal adjustment, and almost no attention at all. The suspension was designed to be forgotten. There was nothing left to rust, sag, squeak, or snap, and the ride floated serenely where its rivals hammered and crashed. The car practically apologized to its passengers for the state of the pavement. Every bump that reached the cabin had been quietly negotiated down at the wheel first. The price of all this grace was complexity. Independent suspension at every corner was costly to build and unfamiliar to the corner mechanic who would one day have to fix it. An unfamiliar repair is the kind that quietly never gets done. Today, four-wheel independent suspension is so utterly normal that its absence is a reviewer's complaint, fitted to humble economy cars whose owners have never once given it a thought. Tucker did not merely soften the ride for the wealthy. He cut the cord between the passenger and the road and kept only the few sensations actually worth feeling. Number 1, the perimeter safety frame. Tucker Corporation, 1948. The idea was that the structure of the car itself should be the first thing to absorb a crash, long before the soft human cargo inside it ever had to. Tucker wrapped the entire passenger compartment in a perimeter frame. It was a steel ring running around the outside of the cabin, designed to take a side impact and route the force around the occupants instead of through them. Into the roof, he built a roll bar, so the car could land upside down and still refuse to fold flat. The frame did the suffering so the people inside it would not have to. The whole structure was conceived as a cage that happened to be beautiful, a suit of armor wearing white wall tires. The car was assembled in a vast Chicago plant that had built aircraft engines during the war, once among the largest buildings in the world. Detroit looked hard at this and saw only cost, weight, and a crushing tooling bill, the three things the annual model change business existed to avoid. The major manufacturers would not widely adopt this kind of structural crash protection for roughly another 30 years. That single gap is the entire reason this car has earned the phrase ahead of its time. And this is where the story turns dark. To pay for all of it, Tucker sold stock to the public and pre-sold dealer franchises and a whole catalog of accessories. He raised more than $15 million from people who simply believed in the car. Few of those buyers would ever receive a finished automobile. The Securities and Exchange Commission accused him of fraud, and the newspapers did the rest of the damage. The company collapsed in 1949 before it could deliver the cars it had already taken money for. A jury later acquitted Preston Tucker on every single count against him, but the verdict arrived long after the factory had gone cold and silent. The rumor that has never quite died is darker still. The established industry, frightened by an automobile this advanced, helped make certain a federal investigation arrived at exactly the most ruinous possible moment. Tucker did not lose because his car was bad. He lost because his car was good enough to be inconvenient to powerful people. Looking across all 8 features, the pattern is almost unbearable to sit with. Not one of them was a bad idea. Every single one is either standard equipment on the road today or written directly into the safety laws that govern every car in every driveway. The Tucker did not fail a test of engineering. It failed a test of timing. And timing is the one thing no patent has ever managed to protect. Of the 51 cars ever built, 47 survive, hunted by collectors and parked in museums like evidence from a trial that never reached its verdict. The last one to cross the block at a major Mecum auction sold for around $1.9 million. The all-time record for the mark at auction stands close to $3 million. The cheapest car Preston Tucker ever set out to build became one of the most valuable in the world, while the company that made it lasted barely a year. The good ideas survived. The man who had them did not get to.